Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to Woody's Workshop. Today I'm going to be showing you how to replace a alternator bracket gasket or a oil cooler thermostat gasket, this little guy right here, on a 2007 to 2010 X5 with the N62 engine, the 4.8 liter. It's only about a $5 gasket. And if you were to take this to the dealership or an independent shop, it's probably going to cost you somewhere around $1,000 to replace this. And like I said, this little gasket's only $5. So with some basic hand tools and a little bit of knowledge, it should be something most people can fix on their own. So with that being said, let's get right to it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is remove this air box and all these pipes here. We're going to have to remove the fan in order to remove the alternator to get down there to the actual gasket itself. So you just need a panel popper tool or a pocket screwdriver to pop these little plastic rivets out. Once those are out of the way, there's little retaining tabs at the bottom. Up. You need to unplug your mass airflow sensor, and you need to disconnect your intake. It is a 6mm or a flathead screwdriver. Once that's disconnected, the whole air box will pop up. Out of the way. So now that the airbox is out of the way, we are going to need to remove this elephant trunk looking piece here. And there's just another 6mm hose clamp. It's a little tricky to get to. You'll probably need a 1/4 inch ratchet. Loosen that up, pop it up and out of the way. There's the clamp I was talking about. They kind of cut away a little section for you to be able to access it. It's just a little bit hard to see. Now we'll have to remove this support brace in order to get the cooling fan out of the way. The hood latch cable just clips into the front of it. You just unclip it. There's four 13mm bolts holding this on. And there is one 10mm nut right here holding the power steering lines onto it. Once those are out of the way, you can slide the bar towards the driver's side and out. We're now ready to remove the cooling fan. You will need to disconnect this connector right here. That's your electrical connector for the fan. And then there are retaining tabs on both the left and the right hand side of the fan. There's one right there. You just push down on the top half of it with either a long screwdriver, or if you have a long panel tool, you just push down on that top tab right there. And there, like I said, there's one on each side, and you'll be able to lift it out. On the driver's side, it's a little bit different. The once you push in the tab, there's actually a bracket that you have to fold in towards the inside of the fan in order to clear the upper radiator hose to raise the fan shroud out of the car. So here is the retaining tab I was talking about that you have to, when it's installed, it sits right here and the tab goes over the top of it. Once you compress the tab, you'll have to fold it in like that in order to clear the upper radiator hose in order to slide it out of the vehicle. Alright, so looking at the front of the engine, we are going to need to remove the three 10mm nuts on this bracket that goes over the top of the power steering pump. That's going to be necessary in order to remove the belt and ultimately be able to get the alternator out of the vehicle so we can access the cap where the gasket is. This bracket can be kind of a pain in the butt to remove, so just take your time. It's more of a by feel thing than sight, and just know there are 3 on there. So I'll show you how to do that now. So here you can see the bracket removed. There's the 2 10 millimeters on the left hand side, and then there's this one all the way here in the back. That's kind of on the bottom right of the bracket. Once that's out of the way, you just kind of tuck it off to the side. And just be careful, the radiator is right here. So if you're worried about it, you can always slide a piece of cardboard in front of it just to kind of protect it. Okay, so with the bracket tucked out of the way, we now have full access to the belt. You will need a T60 socket in order to turn the tensioner back and relieve the tension off the belt for removal. There you can see the tensioner. The T60 goes right in there, and to remove it, you will turn it clockwise to pull this pulley right here back and relieve the tension. Then you can just slide the belt off, and then we'll be ready to remove the alternator. There you go, belt's removed. So prior to removing the alternator, on the driver's hand side, there is your battery cable jump post. You're going to want to take this 13 millimeter nut or bolt out and pull the cable from outside. This is the feed to your starter and to your alternator. The reason we're going to disconnect this is because we don't want to risk arcing the battery cable on the alternator to the frame or to your oil cooler lines when you're removing the alternator. So this just eliminates the possibility of that happening. Okay, so now in front of the alternator, we will need to remove this pulley right here, and we will also need to remove this metal bracket right here. There's just a 10 millimeter nut down here holding this bracket in place. Once you take that nut off, it'll just allow us to get some movement in this line here to get it out of our way when we're trying to get the alternator out. But this pulley right here, you just take a screwdriver and pop the front cap off of it. The front cap just pops off. Once that's off, there is a T50 bolt holding it on. Once you loosen that, it'll come right off. You can now see that 10 millimeter bolt much more clearly. Just remove that. So now that we have everything out of the way of our alternator, there are only 2 E14 bolts holding it in place. You have one right here, and you have one right there. Once you remove those, you might need to use a pry bar between the alternator bracket and the alternator itself to kind of loosen it up, to be able to slide it towards the front of the car and out. And also remember, you do have your battery cable is still connected to it, although it's not connected directly to the battery because we disconnected it earlier. And there is also a small electrical connector on the alternator, so don't just go ripping it out of there. You do have to use some patience with it. All right, just to make this a little easier on me, I am going to remove the belt tensioner. It's just one 16mm bolt, and that'll give me a lot more space. Get that out of the way. Here's the connector that I was talking about. You got to kind of cock the alternator to the side, so you'll be able to disconnect the connector and then also remove the battery cable off of it. And the nut on the battery cable is a 13mm. Once you remove the nut, you can pop the cable off. Pull the alternator out. Okay, so one thing before I go ahead and start taking apart the side of the engine to get to that gasket, I just wanted to discuss diagnosing this oil leak. If you're having oil dripping on the driver's side on the ground, one other thing that you want to just make sure is that it's not coming from your timing cover gaskets here. You got to check down in the corners as well and see if there's any oil on top of the alternator. If there's oil running down off the top of the alternator, chances are that the leak is probably coming from your upper timing cover gaskets, and that's something you would want to address prior to doing this repair. As you can see, my vehicle is nice and dry up top. There's no oil leaks anywhere. Everything's dry. So I'm 100% confident that this is where my oil leak is coming from. But I'll show you what it looks like under the vehicle. As you can see, it is leaking quite a bit. I mean, this is just from a couple days of sitting in the garage. Underneath, you'll see oil dripping off your front differential. And this oil leak is usually a little bit heavier than a timing cover gasket, because the area that the gasket seals is actually under oil pressure. So when it leaks, it can leak pretty rapidly. As you can see, it's running all the way back to the passenger rear corner of my stiffening plate and dripping off back there as well. So it can be a pretty rapid oil leak, and it's not something you want to leave unattended, because it's only going to get worse from this point. So I just wanted to show you that and kind of give you a little bit of a tip as far as diagnosing it. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove all these underbody panels, just because when you do pull the cooler lines off, you're gonna leak some oil out, and you don't want to make a huge mess on all these panels. It'll just help with the cleanup process if we go ahead and remove all this stuff now. So on this front plastic panel, there are just quarter turn Phillips head fasteners. The ones in the front do come out. All the ones remaining on the back stay in place. Alright, so now for the rear panel here, it is going to be 16mm bolts. There are 6 of them in total. So I'll go ahead and take those out now. You can see all the oil built up on this. Once you pull those lines off, it's just going to saturate this, and it'll just be a huge mess. You have to remove this to really clean the car properly. Alright, so as you can see with the underbody panel removed, there's quite a bit of oil on the bottom of this. Definitely not something you want to leave unattended. Alright, so what we need to do now is we have these 2 oil cooler lines here. This one and this one. They're actually bolted onto the front of the cylinder head on this bracket right here. there's a 10mm bolt that bolts to the front timing cover. You just have to take that 10mm bolt out, so these lines will have a little bit of wiggle room. That way when we loosen them from the actual thermostat block down there, we'll have enough wiggle in them to move them out of the way. It'll just help us access the remaining bolts on the block. Alright, so I've got that 10mm bolt removed from the front timing cover, so now I have a little bit of play in these oil cooler lines. I'm going to do my best to show you the actual cap where the gasket actually sits. It's going to be hard for me to get on camera. It's pretty low visibility. When you're doing the repair, you can't even really see it. It's more of a by feel thing, so I'll try to sneak my camera in there. So there is the cap right there. The gasket is sealed up against the block behind this, and as you can see, there's a bolt holding the cooler lines in. That's a T45. So you'll need a Torx 45 on a 1/4-inch ratchet to get that bolt out in order to pop those lines out. And then there are E12 bolts. I believe there's 3. I can't quite remember, but I believe there's 3 holding the cap onto the block. You can see one there at the bottom. You can actually see the oil dripping off of it, just to confirm that this is what's leaking on my vehicle. But I'm probably not going to be able to leave the camera in here when I'm removing this. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it, and I'll show it to you once I get it out. So this is what it looks like with the 2 oil cooler lines disconnected. Once you remove that T45 bolt, you just wiggle them and pop them right out of the bracket there. Try to see if I can show you the bolts. You can see the 2 there on the bottom. One closest to the left, one all the way over to the right. See if I can get it to focus. There you go. There's those 2 on the bottom. Then there's this one up here on the top. There is a bracket on the top bolt that holds the vent tube for your front differential. You can see it clipped into the front diff right there. That bracket, you just leave it clipped onto the line, but just remember that's there, so when you're reinstalling, you put it back on correctly. Okay, so here it is removed from the vehicle. I misspoke earlier. The bottom 2 bolts are E10s, and the top bolt that has the bracket for the front differential vent tube is an E12. So they're 2 different sizes. These 2 are E10s. This one is an E12, and your hold down for the oil cooler feed and return lines is a T45. This is pretty much the whole thing. There's the gasket that we're going to be replacing, and all this is just a thermostat for the oiling system. Essentially what it does is, once the oil in the engine reaches operating temp, there's a little spring and a valve in here, and once it reaches operating temp, this opens up and allows oil to flow to and from your oil cooler. Nothing really too fancy about it. Let me see if I can show you what it looks like now that I've got it removed. So that's the engine block side. Now you want to just wipe this down with a rag, make sure there's nothing, no dirt or debris on the mating surface there. Once it's all clean, you just swap the gasket. You probably need a pick out the old gasket, clean this up, throw the new one in, and put it back together. Okay, so there it is reinstalled with the new gasket. Got my oil lines bolted back up, cleaned everything off for the most part. And now we're ready to put the alternator back in. So one trick with the alternator is there's a inlaid adjusting screw inside the this portion of the alternator, and if you see right there, it's kind of protruding from the alternator. It makes it really difficult to reinstall because it's a really tight fit. So one way to tap that back in is put the bolt back in, take your socket, your E14 socket with an extension, put it on the end of the bolt, and then tap it with a hammer until this is flush with the actual casing of the alternator. This will just help with installation when you go to install it, it will slide right together. Then when you put the bolt back in and tighten it back up, it'll pull that adjusting sleeve up to the actual alternator bracket and secure the alternator in place. But this is just a little tip for the installation. See it now. If I can hold it up here, you can see it's flush. It's no longer sticking out. Okay, so now that we've got the alternator back in, we can go ahead and throw the belt tensioner back on. We can put our idler pulley back onto the alternator. Now we're ready to put our belt back on. So we've got our belt back on. Now all that's left is putting this cover or bracket back over the top of the power steering pump, bolting it up, and then we can slide the fan back in place. Alright, so that's pretty much it. All that's left to do is just clean up all the residual oil on the underbody panels and underneath the vehicle, top off the oil level, and just check for leaks. One thing I did forget to mention is these two sockets come in super handy. They are 1/4 inch swivel E10 and E12 sockets. I know they're kind of an abnormal tool, but If you have a tool guy or you look online, you can find these on Amazon. VIM tools manufactures little sockets like this that are much more affordable than going with like a snap-on or a Mac socket. Outside of that, that's pretty much the whole job. Like I said before, this is about $1,000 plus job at a dealership or an independent shop, and really all it is just this little $5 gasket. It is a little tricky to get down there and replace, especially if you haven't done it before, but it can be done, you know, in an afternoon. Some people, it might take you a full day, but if it saves you $995, you know, maybe that's worth it to you. So as always, if you found this helpful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.